All right. So, welcome everybody. Episode 13, Office Hours with JNL. Good to have you back, man. Last week we missed you a little bit. We had a great discussion, Lexi and I. What was great about that is I learned so much about her and her journey, which was awesome. And I've also learned a lot about kind of some of the victories she's had, some of the challenges, and kind of the next direction she's going. And she gave me some great insight on the industry, the entertainment industry, but also her perspective on what's been happening to the Palestinians. And so we're grateful for that. So thank you, Lexi, if you listen to this episode. She also posted it on X today. She highlighted it with her audience. So we're appreciative of that because she got to watch the first episode, Liam, and she called it Office Hours with JNL Origins, which I thought was a pretty cool name to the first episode. But today's episode is going to cover a number of topics. What we're going to do first is review One Country by Ali Abu Na'meh, a book written in 2005 by a Palestinian American author, which we just finished as a book club that I host and you join regularly on TikTok. So if you're listening to this, go to TikTok at JNS7171. We host book club every Tuesday, Thursday at 7:40 at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We're going to start A Quiet Revolution, which is our 7th book this Thursday, tonight, as a matter of fact, which is September 4th, I believe, or 3rd today, September 4th. And so I want to just give a brief synopsis of the book. Mind you, written in 2005, 2006 by a Palestinian American author. It was a great look at how there could be a solve for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in terms of a one-state solution, right? And he draws on where there's a multi-ethnic community such as Belgium, the South African apartheid. And he spends a lot of time talking about that and what that looks like, or what it could potentially look like for Palestinians in Israel. And he gives a good balanced approach to obviously the overwhelming trauma that Palestinians have had, but also draws references on the psychological trauma that some Israelis have had over the years. And I've got to say, as a Palestinian American, I think he spends more time talking about, the government within Israel who's thwarted a lot of the peace negotiations throughout the years, and actually references two leaders from the H group who actually proposed before the 5 peace treaties, other peace treaties that were thwarted at some point. So if you haven't read One Country by Ali Abu Na'meh, I highly encourage it. It's 6 chapters, an excellent read, thought-provoking, written in 2005, 2006. Obviously, the landscape has changed as of today, but he predicts a lot of what's been happening, just as so many others have predicted what's happening to the Israeli government through the course of the last 19 years. And one particular scholar that reminds me of who has predicted what's happening to the Israeli government in the country is John Mearsheimer in his essay From After Zionism, right? Clear prediction as to what's happening. And then I love the fact, one of the things that really resonated with me, and this is my last thing here, is he talked about the concessions that Yasser Arafat made in terms to be able to have power versus Nelson Mandela, who did not concede to power and wanted it and stayed in prison so that ultimately his ANC and other advocates of the dismantlement of apartheid would have a one man, one vote, one person, one vote in South Africa so that both groups can live equally, but not losing their ethnicity, not losing their culture or tradition. So again,
right.
One Country by Ali Abu Na'meh. Today's topic, so transitioning now, today's topic is...
Actually, I want to add a couple things on this.
Please.
Okay, so first off, just as another advert, definitely go and join Jamal's regular book club. It's the JBS TikTok Dad account. So if you're not already following that on TikTok, please do. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we get together in the evenings and chat about whatever comes up. The first few books done were all kind of interesting, and several were ones I hadn't read, which was cool. But this one and the next one were among some options that I proposed for where we could go next, which I thought would be fun. You made an interesting point about it in saying that despite being near 20 years old, it actually lays out where the core problems are, and you can predict from it how it will keep getting worse if nothing is changed. What's honestly most disgusting to me, and maybe this is just thinking in historical terms, is that all of this has been predictable for a long time.
Yeah.
There are basic ideological and structural features here that are going to continue to make things worse for Palestinians. And we're finally up to a point where you've got YouTubers out there saying, hey, if you gave me a button and I could press a button and kill every single Palestinian, I would do it. I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
I saw that.
But
Disgusting.
that's a direct consequence of an ideological framework and of racism, of nationalism. And it'll relate a little bit to the topic that we want to talk about today. But it is interesting the degree to which all of this has been so predictable. And really so often predicted too. When you've got people writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s over and over again, laying out, okay, here is the problem. This is going to keep getting worse. And then we do nothing about it. There are so many, not only Palestinian, but Israeli scholars who are actually looking at this and saying, this is a problem. This is getting worse. Why aren't we fixing this shit? When tons of when Israelis who educate themselves well enough, who study this material, frequently, almost universally, come to the conclusion that Israel must be dismantled in its current form, there's a problem that we're not paying attention to. And I think that so much of the way this is built up really doesn't have anything to do with evidence. It doesn't have anything to do with the logic or the reason behind it. There are specific ideological reasons for Christian Zionists to keep supporting it. You know, for nationalists to keep supporting it. They don't really care about what will work or what could bring peace, because peace has never been the goal, and it needs to become the goal. So I love what you do and what I try to do, and what we're all trying to contribute here in this broader like ecosystem where we're sharing ideas, is that we're helping to arm another generation to gird themselves for battle on this, to challenge these ideas, to, instead of passively accepting that things can't change, or
status
that
quo.
we should do this, that, or the other thing. We should talk about the peace process and the two-state solution and all the rest of this horse shit that just keeps dragging this on indefinitely. If we're trying to provide resources for people so that they can challenge that and change the narrative. So I'm hopeful, but it's also very, very frustrating as a historian to see how slowly it changes decade on decade.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted some really good points, because he talks about Israeli scholars in his book and their proposals towards a peaceful resolution, and he talks about maintaining the status quo, because that's what's been happening. No matter how much research you've done, no matter how many writers and authors and scholars have written about the potential demise or dismantling of this apartheid system, nothing has changed. I think part of that stems from the fact that the global community fears of placing sanctions and embargoes, as they did with South Africa. But we also have to consider the U.S.'s complicity in this, right? I think the U.S. government, particularly, constantly thwarts any actions that may impose sanctions or embargoes, because I think about, okay, let's go to the Security Council and place embargoes or sanctions. You know, there's going to be a veto, right? Until other countries say, I don't care what the U.S. says. We don't need a resolution. We're just not going to do trade with you. We're done, right? Just as happened with South Africa. Yeah, they placed arms embargoes and sanctions, but there were companies that said, we're done. We don't want the guilt by association. I think that needs to happen sooner rather than later, because as you can see what's happening in the West Bank, Tulkarm and Jenin. Jenin has been evacuated, and now they're shifting a lot of their focus on the West Bank. They continue to talk about what's happening with Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and all of a sudden people are not talking about Gaza anymore, right? It's like, all right, where are we here? And so, great call outs. And I'm excited about today's conversation too, because there's going to be a ton of discussion about capitalism, imperialism, and racism, and the intersectionality between those three topics. And so before we get into it, was there anything else you wanted to add before we dive right in and take a few laps around?
Not really. I think this will be kind of fun. There's a lot of pieces of this that are just floating around all the time because I'm doing a course this semester, like a senior seminar on Orientalism and racism and imperialism. So kind of keeps me thinking about a lot of this stuff lately. And what I want to talk about today will in part relate to the first part of the capitalism when we started.
Yep.
But I'm going to talk about a lot of things that are separate from that, but it'll intersect with it a little bit. So it's useful. So for anybody who's paying attention to that, you can kind of think of this as like 1A or something. Like there's pieces of this that we can annex to that and then still carry that forward, because there's a few points about the early development of capital that will actually help to create the conditions for race and racism in the world. So that I think that's an interesting framing point to keep in mind, is that while this isn't the direct sequel to that, it has pieces of it that are part of that equation, so might be useful to you. But I think we should probably start with like a basic. If I want racism to be the main topic today, then what is that? So Jamal, how do you usually hear racism described? Like, what does it mean, do you think? Like, what do we...
When I think racism, I think institution, systematic. I think the oppressor, oppressing the oppressed, the marginalized groups, those that don't have power, right? And that's what I think of when I think of racism. Again, institutionalized, systematic, those in power, oppressing the marginalized groups in terms of opportunity, growth, socioeconomic status, career growth. Those are the things that come to mind when I think racism.
Yeah, all of that's really good. There's an interesting problem I find for a lot of people in approaching this, because anybody who is a little bit more familiar with this, who's thought about it a bit more, who's read about it a bit more, is going to come to a conclusion that you're dealing with oppressive social structures, that it is systemic, and therefore it's ultimately connected to power relations. But when you run into people all the time, you're talking about this, as soon as you mention that it's about power relations, well, they say, well, no, that's not what the dictionary says, yo. And then they take a very simplistic view on it.
No, can't be the dictionary definition.
Right. And well, the trick here is it's actually both. And that's where they're misunderstanding it. Because the racism as an ideological structure, right, as a concept, as it develops, is referring to dividing people into different races and then assigning certain qualities to them, certain value judgments. You know, these people are better than those people. That kind of calculation goes in there. So it's breaking people into groups and then creating a hierarchy of them. But that can only happen through power relations. So when somebody is just being a dick on the street or a bigot or something, yeah, that's possible, and that happens with everybody, and sometimes it's tied into those power relations and sometimes not. So people try to say sometimes, and you get these weird confusions that, like, well, such and such minority can't be racist. Well, no, technically anybody can be a bigot, anybody can be prejudiced, anybody can have that kind of like knee-jerk rejection of others that divides people into categories. But by doing that, that person is using the exact same ideological structure. They're dividing people up, but they lack the power to actually restructure society along their vision. And the world that we live in was built by Euro-American populations that did have that power. So while somebody can adopt a lot of the same prejudice discourses and the same idea of dividing people up into races, that are better or worse, one has had a direct impact on the world and the other has not. So it gets confusing because honestly, when people talk about racism purely in terms of power relations, they're correct. And when people
Right.
talk about it in terms of bigotry and dividing people up, they're also correct. But we kind of need to understand both if we're going to look at the problem of racism,
Sure.
the impact it has on the world. And
Right.
ultimately, if you can understand its origins and successfully critique and deconstruct those origins and move away from them, then at the end of the day, all the other bigotries that are based on that can go away. This is why it's really funny when people get very triggered about criticism of whiteness as an idea, because dismantling whiteness is how you dismantle the whole concept of racism. It's not like, oh, if white people don't exist as a category anymore, then it's suddenly going to become like some black supremacist world or some stupid shit like that. The whole point is to break down that idea of dividing people up. It's not a critique on people's skin color. When I say I hate the concept of whiteness, it doesn't mean I hate myself because
Right.
it's not part of my self definition. It's a category imposed through social power relations specifically to divide people up and oppress them.
Mm.
And the concept itself has to go away. So what I want to try and do in our little hour here is talk through its origins. Like, where does it come from and how does it build up the way it is, to where today people just take it for granted and everyone's just saying, well, we'll never get rid of racism because people are always going to be mean to each other or something. Like, yeah, but that's not the point. I mean, people in ancient Rome said bad shit about Syrians, like almost
Right.
dirty Syrians, but they weren't racist towards them. They've dug up Roman graves in northern England that have Syrians in them. They served in the army. They were part of Roman society.
Right.
But so that kind of in-group, out-group bigotry is not what we mean by racism.
Right.
Right. So
I think it's and correct me on this, Liam, if I'm wrong, but I think when you think social structure, I think communities, how they're divided up into affluent, low to moderate income communities, that social structure, I think, is systemic of what is an example of what you're referring to, right? So for those listening, I mean, when you think of where people are living today and the impact that has on them as an example of what we can draw on.
Yeah, there's a great deal of contemporary classism has its origins in racism. And a lot of the socially segregated structures that build up, a lot of them tied into economics, it has a lot to do with things. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the question of slavery in a moment, but just as a kind of advanced point about that connects to this, people are always saying like, oh, slavery was in the distant past, it's long ago, it's abolished, there's no one alive today who was enslaved, so it's not a big deal, so why do we need reparations, blah blah blah. Well, the point is, when slavery was dismantled, we didn't do anything for the former enslaved people. We just said, okay, like, you're not a slave anymore, survive somehow. So they were forced into these economically marginal conditions that continued for, well, in different degrees all the way to the present. But you had people being just arrested for jaywalking and then sentenced to hard labor and then sold to mines and plantations and worked like literal slaves. That's what happened after slavery. The lucky ones ended up being like tenant farmers, sharecroppers, something like that, trying to survive, but dependent totally upon the people who own the land. Whereas if we had, like, I don't know, this is a podcast, so I don't have to use like TikTok-y type language here or worry about this stuff. What if we had executed all the Confederates? What if we had just straight up hanged all these motherfuckers, taken all of their property, divided it up into family plots, and given it to all of the former enslaved? We would not have the problems we have today, because that population would have risen economically, and they would have been integrating more. They would have been mixing with people more because of the class issues. They would have actually had a leg up. They would have been equivalent to the white farming classes that existed down there, rather than a subordinate population that then people could manipulate all through like the late 19th and across the 20th century, trying to like stop any kind of solidarity, divide people up, make people think the color of their skin matters more than their socioeconomic conditions. But at the end of the day, money plays a huge part in this. Class plays a huge part in this, and racism is used specifically to manipulate class ideologies, to break a sense of working class solidarity and instead get people to think more in terms of racial solidarity. What they want is for people like me to look at Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and say, I want to be like them. They're just like me. And they're not. They're just not. I identify far more with like the Hispanic and Black proletariat in the area I grew up with than I will ever identify with some rich white dude. But that's what they want you to do. They want to create racial solidarity to replace that kind of class thinking.
It's interesting. It's interesting you say, had we executed the Confederates and give them lands and so on, I wish there was a thought-provoking leader in that moment. And again, I'm like dreaming here, that would have said, all right, slavery's abolished. We need to do reparations in this moment in freaking time and not wait and still continue to argue whether reparations are appropriate until today, 2024. But again, that's wishful thinking. Go fucking figure. I cursed on the show. Like, what the hell are y'all talking about?
So General Sherman, as he's marching through, just Georgia, burning everything down wherever he goes. Sherman did and they actually authorized and got government approval for dividing up Confederate states and giving 50 acres and a mule to all the former enslaved. So all those families have gotten divided up plantations. That was approved. That was proposed by Sherman and approved by Lincoln. When Lincoln died and Johnson took his place, Johnson was on a unity ticket with him. He was a Southern Democrat. Lincoln was trying to be like very big about this, but then he dies. And his vice president says very bluntly, this is a white man's country. This will always be a white man's country. I will do everything I can to entrench white power and white supremacy. And he did. And that's the direction we went instead. So that order was rescinded. If that order instead had been built upon and spread across the entire former Confederacy and those plantations had been broken up, it would have broken the economic power of the racist elites that created Jim Crow. They would not have been able to do that. It could have actually become democratic. It kind of relates a little bit to the One Country book in that sense, because what we're really asking, Israelis to do is to actually want a real democracy. Like, do you want a secular democracy? Okay, cool. That means giving equal civil rights to all Palestinians and not being a fucking ethno-state. That's what we've never done in the U.S. We absolutely refused to grant actual equality to people. We didn't even fully abolish slavery. We just shifted it to prisons.
Well, I don't want to digress, but since you brought it up, I was listening to someone yesterday, and okay, fuck it. I don't believe I'm freaking listening to this shit from this guy. Yeah. So they're having a discussion about the apartheid that is Israel. And again, they're referencing the 20% Palestinians in Israel proper. And saying, well, there's still 20% Palestinians, and so it's not really an apartheid. And one of the other guys goes, so why are they calling it apartheid? Oh, it's just for political gain. Are you freaking kidding me? Exactly. And I'm thinking to myself, obviously, the guy on top asking the question is an idiot. And the guy on the bottom is in complete denial, right? One is Zionist, the other is an ally of the Israeli government. And I'm like, I'm not going to go up there. I'm just going to listen and just think of the old story I tell between the tiger and the donkey. Have you heard that one? Let's just tell a little. Yeah. So, never argue with an ass. So I chose to move on, but I'm just baffled by the fact that we're still having this conversation about, it's just for political gain. What political gain are you talking about when for the last God knows how many decades it's been called an apartheid, and now there's an advisory opinion stating such, and all of a sudden it's political gain? what world are you living in
Israeli
other than
NGOs have been saying this for ages. Israeli newspapers have been saying this for ages. And the bigger problem, and the main reason the word comes up, is it's actually a reference to the territories where there are literally millions of Palestinians with zero rights at all, yet Israel asserts permanent sovereign control over that land.
Yep.
And there are settlers. There's more than 500,000 settlers living among them, and they all have rights, but the Palestinians do not. That's literal apartheid, and it's worse than anything that ever existed in South Africa. But even inside Israel, and I've seen this over and over again, you can discriminate in housing and employment and everything else. There's no actual protections from that, and there's massive disparities in like services offered. So if the community is all Palestinians, they just ignore it. They don't invest in it. But some Israeli Jews want to build a new town, then there's tons of money available for it and connection to infrastructure and everything else. Like the Palestinian parts of Israel are quite poor compared to the rest of the country, and that is part of deliberate policy. Yeah. So it's more like Jim Crow inside Israel and apartheid in the territories.
Yeah,
but
even Ali in his book One Country, again, we'll jump right back. He talks about the budget allocated for education per capita. He talks about the Jewish students get roughly around $1,200 to $1,500, where the Palestinian children get about $160 per capita. It's crazy. I mean, this is 2005. I assume it's been adjusted. I have to dig in, but that is baffling to me. I keep using that word, which is just freaking disgusting and vile. Anyhow,
they want the Palestinian population to be less educated, hence economically disadvantaged, hence poorer, hence eventually they'll just emigrate, because that's the whole point. They want to drive Palestinians completely off the land. So the total reality is a mix between Jim Crow and apartheid, but the places that are under apartheid laws are literally worse than South Africa, and the people are still debating this in 2024. Is just infuriating.
Yeah.
But
last point, and then I'm gonna come back to you. You mentioned earlier the guy on YouTube that talks about pressing a button and eliminating all the Palestinians. The other puzzling thing to me and very disturbing is that video will circulate and go viral, but try to provide content that's educational about Palestine, and it feels like it gets suppressed way beneath the earth. And so that is such a freaking hypocrisy, a double standard, educational versus someone who is a maniac, basically. Yeah. So
it's ultimately tied to power relations. Because the state here and capital interests as a whole do have an interest in that status quo. So they're going to support the existence of that status quo. It makes everybody money. Why would you? People don't, like, out of corporations or governments, take like purely principled positions that have in no way benefit them. That doesn't work in the way we've structured this planet. There's always a reason for it, and you can usually follow the lines that connect people to things.
Totally.
The social media companies simply make more money by being harder on us than they are on Zionists, and that's just the way it is. It's fucked up, but it just tells us again how far we have to go. But the fact that we're able to talk as much as we are, like there was a decision out of that the advisory body that Meta set up a few years ago as like an arbiter of last resort, like that any decision they make is final in terms of their content moderation. And they came out saying that From the River to the Sea is not a hate speech comment and is perfectly fine on the 3 Meta platforms.
That's awesome.
Where people had been trying to say the statement means violent genocide, which is fucking nonsense in 99% of uses of it. But,
especially when it says that in the Likud charter as well. And now someone on the platform was saying that the watermelon is racist.
Yeah, but it's nice that at least we are pushing back enough, and there's enough of us involved that we can actually even get decisions like that it's even possible, because that kind of suppression has been the norm for a long time, and we're beginning to chip away at it a little bit at a time. It's telling us we're doing the right thing. Awesome. So let's do some more of that today. Let's chip away at the concept of racism and
Way
divide
to
and rule.
transition. Go for it.
There's a starting point for this that I like to place in two distinct things. One is political, one's economic, and they're related. They're tied together, and it's one of the reasons I say that this kind of follows on from some of the stuff we were doing in the capitalism series we still have to continue, because the development of the modern nation state, with its much more highly centralized institutions, directly parallels the rise of capitalism as an ideology. The two are work together. Capitalism is only possible in highly centralized states, which is one of the reasons I laugh so much at like anarcho-capitalists who think that they can be capitalists with no government. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's just incoherent. But the two rose together because they work together, and one is necessary for the other. They're a unit. And the political shifts, what really starts to change the politics, and what ultimately sets the stage for the flowering of mercantile capitalism and later liberal capitalism, is the wars of religion in Europe. When Christians were just going apeshit, killing each other over minor doctrinal differences. I mean, the French wars of religion were bad enough between like the Calvinists or Huguenot population of France versus like the Catholics, and that's raging 1562 to 98, so late 16th century. Okay. And then the early 17th century, things actually get worse. So starting about 1618 and carrying up through when it's finally shutting down in 48, the German wars of religion were sometimes called the 30 Years' War. And those conflicts are so fucking brutal that they killed about a third of the German-speaking population of Europe. Just think about that proportionally. Wow. How messed up that is. Like, every third person you know was killed, probably just because somebody didn't like that they prayed to the Virgin Mary or something or other, like just some minor doctrinal issue that people are fighting about. It's horrifying. And the key that got a lot of the power elite thinking is what they can do about that. How do you stop populations from slaughtering each other over religious differences? Because this becomes a problem inside countries too, doesn't it? Like, what if a country has believers in two different forms of Christianity, and they're killing each other over that? Well, then you have no effective political authority. You can't do anything. The country can't really build, grow, do anything, because its people are massacring each other, right? So what they start doing is thinking, how can we transfer people's sense of self, their identity, from something that's inherently transnational, like a religious sect? You know, think about Catholicism, like the one true universal church. I mean, Catholic literally means universal. It was intended to be everybody. So like, the church. So it's not supposed to fit into borders, right? A lot of religions are like that. They're not intended to be tied to borders. Ethno-religions exist, but they're relatively uncommon in the modern world. They were a common feature of the ancient world, but not by this period. So you're dealing with ideas that are inherently disconnected from a single place. It doesn't matter that John Calvin was in Geneva, Switzerland. Calvinism took root in Scotland and the Netherlands, right? I mean, the ideas aren't connected to one physical locality or culture. So what they started doing was trying to figure out, how can we get people within particular borders to share views and ideas and to structure things there. And the piece of this,
when you say they, who was trying to do that?
Oh, the power elite that's ruling these different countries, because they're seeing the population of their countries wanting to fight other peoples as well as itself, as well as each other. And there's a lot of, one of the bigger problems you run into is that if a country is particularly strong, right, then it's going to feel it has the right to go in and push around smaller countries. Right. Think about the way that, U.S. imperialism works in the world. Right. We feel we have the right to, invade Iraq. But, how dare Cuba install missiles in its own country that might threaten us? Scary, scary. We should do something about it. Like, there's this constant need to attack others and defend yourself. that kind of bullying thought is relatively uncommon, though, in the contemporary world. We've moved a bit away from that. And part of the reason that we've moved away from that is rooted in the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, because that created, in legal terms, an understanding of state sovereignty, that within a particular country, whoever's in charge in that country gets to run it how they want, and a country next to it doesn't get to tell them what to do. So maybe you're a tiny German principality, right? And you want to be Lutheran, and giant Catholic France is right next to you. Giant Catholic France can't walk in with troops and say, you must be Catholic now, because the rulers there have decided, no, we're fine being Lutheran. And they get that choice. So that political structure, like the modern sovereign state that should be inviolable, is the reason that we have so many small countries. Look at a map of Europe today versus just over 100 years ago. Look like before World War I, you got like a giant Russian Empire, German Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austrian Empire. You know, like there's these huge states gobbling up most of it. And today there's like all these tiny little countries.
Broken up into a lot of pieces subsequently,
And you can't look at them and say, hey, you know what? My country's bigger. I think I'm just going to invade. Like Hungary can't look at Slovakia and just decide to absorb it, because our entire political and legal structure in the world today says you can't do that. That starts here. Now, where this gets problematic, though, where it gets tricky, is that these kind of states, they're going to be expensive. They're going to cost money. You're going to have to start doing things that they didn't normally do. Because they want people to identify with them, so they have to actually start interacting more in a way, like, you know, building things up. And one of those ways, one of the earliest ways, is through like military type stuff, you know, like having your own army, right? And a professional army that's loyal to the state and not to, say, a king or a religion or something, but literally loyal to that particular government. And from there, it just expands into tons of other areas, infrastructure, education, blah, blah, blah. They keep adding new things, because the whole idea is to keep people buying into that concept, to having loyalty to that state, because it does something. But you're starting with a lot of the military stuff. And that's sort of necessary. You got to defend these small countries and all that. But it's very expensive to do that, which is why the state structures end up getting in bed with capitalism as an idea, with the banking systems.
I was going to ask you, so those are expensive aspects of a country. So how do you get capital for it?
Banks, so bankers, that kind of investment. So
those damn bankers, man, I gotta tell you,
and our recovering bankers.
I love what she said. That she's like a recovering banker. I'm like, oh, that's cool.
It's a lovely way of saying that.
After 30 years of addiction, I'm recovering. Go for it.
It's great. But yeah, so the centralizing trend, the trend of gaining, the pulling more power to the state, which ultimately, I mean, you can't have military, police, anything else without that centralizing power, right? So you're building up these kind of institutions that needs money. That money means reaching out into the capital class, and that's why you end up with mercantile capitalism, which I think we were talking about in that first episode, the version that's much more tied to the state in a sense.
I believe so.
It harbors monopoly companies, that sort of thing.
Right.
But it's all about a sense of, like, I mean, the growth of the military essentially creates a kind of feedback loop toward the modern nation state, because a professional military requires an efficient bureaucracy in order to fund it, to raise the cash for it, which increases government knowledge over people, which therefore gives the state more power over people, and et cetera, et cetera. It just keeps building that way. And digs deeper and deeper connections between the capital class and the state's hierarchies. And as that's going along, what you end up needing over time is certain ideals or ideologies, belief systems. Because if you want people really to accept a status quo, if you want people to be okay with the way things are, and that's what people are usually get really worked up, and they're defending, and like, how dare you talk about these other alternatives? Everything is great. My country's super awesome. Like, they're defending a status quo that they were taught to love, and they were given reasons to love it. And those specific ideals, racism is one of them. It's directly tied to this. So I want to shift for a second there and just talk very briefly about something we're all kind of familiar with, even if we don't know a lot of the details around it, but the Atlantic slave system.
Mm-hmm. And before you get to the Atlantic slave system, I do want to mention something that I think is an important call out. If you think it is, let me know. In terms of patriotism, people serving in the military, coming out, you have that sense of loyalty to country. There's a reason you signed up. And so there's a tremendous amount of influence coming out of the military. You're patriotic. And then that is a ripple effect to those centers of influence that you're around, right? Yeah. And so those folks you're connecting with tends to build that loyalty because you are cascading information, you're cascading your loyalty to other folks, and there's significant impact there. So Atlantic trace.
For military stuff, if you think about the connection as that builds up, I mean, initially you're looking at old European militaries that are a mix of hired mercenaries and then forcibly drafted peasants, and then a kind of aristocratic military like your kind of knight class, right? And then as you start moving toward more professional militaries, what are you doing? You're basically giving a peasant a job. Like, here's an actual career that's going to be paid, a profession, where being in the military generally wasn't, outside of being mercenaries. You know, most military service for most of human history was not paid at all. You were just drafted into it and sent to the front lines to be, stabbed. But you start creating a professional military, so people think, oh, this is my job, and therefore I'm loyal to the state because it's buttering my bread and everything is great. So you would imbibe all that patriotism. And then that builds up more toward the kind of nationalist, the nation state ideals, where you get like kind of whipped up in a sense of like, I need to support my people, my country, and this different thing. And people want to sign up for that, or won't resist conscription as much. They think that they're a part of it, and you get pulled into it. There's a reason that you can see that whole process building steadily for a long time. And it reaches an interesting point during the French Revolutionary Wars with the levée en masse. They basically just drafted a bunch of people, but in the process, they didn't just, here's a gun, go shoot. They indoctrinated them. They started teaching them that this is our band of brothers, right? That we're all in this together. It's us against them. Here's our flag, and we stand for this, and we stand for liberty and equality and brotherhood, and we're going to fight together against the forces that oppose those ideals. They're teaching a set of ideals, and that set of ideals is what makes military service so compelling, in the sense of forming a sense of identity, because you become part of something. You feel a strong group solidarity. I mean,
I remember that in the Marine Corps.
A grenade through the window right here, one of us is going to jump on it. Like it's just what you do. And when in that.
Well, that's what I mean. Look, my military experience stems back, 1989 starts back in 1989 and goes through 1997. And I remember distinctly the ideals that they were instilling in us: the brotherhood, the camaraderie, the stand up for one another, that type of mentality. And one time in church, I believe it was, because we'd go to church every Sunday, and a phrase that resonates with me today: don't die for your country, let the enemy die for theirs. And what I mentioned earlier, look, yes, there's loyalty in joining the military, there's patriotism, but that is not to say that people coming out of the military kind of walk away from that loyalty and patriotism after their experiences, right? That goes without saying, especially if they're suffering from PTSD, they've been in combat. I mean, there's a lot that changes people's lives. So I just want to make sure I had that point.
Yeah, absolutely. It does become a fairly deeply entrenched part of your identity. Even people that end up deconstructing a lot of the ideologies around it, they'll often still feel that kind of loyalty to their comrades, because at the end of the day, what they're often doing is building on something that's pretty fundamental to human nature. We're social animals. We want to work together. We evolved as tribes, as bands of people working together and cooperating within that. That it wasn't just one family. We weren't all like directly related. We were all part of the same tribe, though, and we worked together, building that sense of collective identity. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's how humans work. But when it gets tied to ideologies of violence and oppression and war and racism and everything else, this is where people unfortunately get manipulated that way, which is really messed up. But the sense of common and collective identity that comes out of that, the sense of brotherhood, is genuinely a good thing.
Yeah. So Atlantic slave trade, that was the next section.
For that one, the key really behind this that people are often forgetting is that racism didn't create slavery, or the Atlantic slavery, because slavery of different forms have been around forever, but racism did not create that. It was a consequence of it. What created it was a desire for profit. So this is why, like, the term triangular trade exists, like the way it's moving from like Europe, the Americas, and West Africa. Like that's the rough triangle, right? So you're carrying goods from Europe down to these different African states, and you're trading goods there. And initially, a lot of the kingdoms there were fine with that. Like, we'll trade some stuff here, we'll sell a few people. Then when they realized the scale of it and the type of slavery that Europeans were doing was very different from what they did, they started to object and pass laws against it. So what the Europeans did was they went around those laws. They started like sending people into the interior, talking directly to people, getting people inside those countries to turn on their neighbors. Like, I'm going to offer you all this cool stuff if you go and kidnap a bunch of people for me and bring them to the coast. And then people started doing that. So a lot of the states, a lot of the governments all along West Africa started collapsing because people were chasing the profit that Europeans brought to them and turning on their neighbors. And it led to, in some areas, a significant depopulation. It was quite a negative process there, but it's driven by money, right? So that's your first step of the triangular trade, is bribing people to turn against their neighbors and undermine their own social structures. Well, then you haul those people across the Atlantic, assuming they survive. I mean, especially like the Middle Passage voyages, you know, you're crossing across from Africa to the Caribbean, like all through the equator. I mean, people were dying in droves, and the conditions were terrible on these things. And then when they get there, they're worked to death in sugar plantations, which is a very when it needs to be commercial, when you need it in good quantities, it's very, very dangerous, harsh work, and it's done in very difficult climates too. So the people put to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean could have very short, miserable lives. So what has to be involved in this? If you're treating people like crap at that end, and the process of bringing them across is really bad, with people just like chained flat on their backs, you know, chained together, they can't move, like there's only about this much space in the whole deck, you know, so like you're stuck there. And then, you know, once a day they're going to unchain you, let you come up and, like, you know, walk for a few minutes and then take you back down. People are like puking on you, people are pissing and shitting all over you, people are dying right next to you, and you're chained to them for a whole day in the baking, you know, equatorial sun. It's horrifying.
Right. It's disgusting and unbearable living conditions, right? I mean,
and quite deliberately. Now, the problem here is that when human beings do this to each other, this is where a bit of human nature comes up. You start saying, well, that's messed up. Why are we doing that? This is hard to do. Like, oh, you're telling me I'm supposed to do this like this? That seems harsh, man. And you have to become desensitized to that. And there's a process of desensitization that people can go through. I've studied this in the context of the Nazi Holocaust, where you're seeing people sort of brutalized into being really horrific killers. Like they get sucked into something, you know, that they initially rejected. You know, that psychology can be manipulated by circumstance in some pretty terrible ways. So you're desensitizing people to be doing incredibly inhumane things. But you have a deeper problem, because what about everyone else who just knows about it? What about the casual drinker of tea in London who knows that sugar in her tea may have come from Jamaica, which is a slave plantation island filled with people living in horrifying conditions, who were brought there in even worse conditions, you know, like treated like crap? Like, it can make them feel, oh gosh, we should do something about that. That creates a problem for capital and the state to solve. And I mean them together here because they both profited throughout these mercantile capitalist centuries. You know, initially the Portuguese were doing this stuff, and then like the Dutch got into it hardcore, and they perfected a lot of the worst abuses of this. And then the Brits got involved in it, the English got involved, and like everyone's just making tons and tons of fat cash on the slave trade, you know, moving people across. So they have an incentive to change the way people think about it. Does that make sense so far?
It does. It does. And so talk more about that in terms of how it makes sense, because I understand the drive for profit and the need for profit, but how does it start making sense? What do you mean by that?
Okay, so what you have to do is you have to get people thinking about themselves a little differently, thinking about other humans differently, in a way that will ultimately desensitize you to the suffering of others, even if you're not directly part of that. Because it's one thing to like take some teenage guy and like show him how to like whip slaves and tell him it's all right, and then as his brain isn't even finished maturing yet, and he grows up doing that shit, and as an adult he's a terrible motherfucking person doing that because he's been brutalized into that system. But the person
he's been indoctrinated into that
hasn't done that. The person sipping tea in London has never experienced that, so to them it just sounds brutal as hell, and it's terrible. It's the default human position of empathy, right?
But how does that? So I recognize the indoctrination of a young, impressionable into person, right?
Right.
But the person drinking that tea who says this is horrible, yet does nothing to change it.
Right, and that's the problem. Is that there were attempts to shift these things. There's a lesson you can see from pretty early on with the Spanish, because early Spanish colonists were taking over huge chunks of land filled with Native American populations in the encomienda system. And in the chunk of land that each one had, they could do whatever they wanted. The people were just cattle to them. They could do whatever they wanted. And so they enslaved them, they raped them, they murdered them. They were terrible. And it contributed to the massive die-off of Native American populations. And that was actually reformed internally by a whole bunch of Catholics saying, these seem like they're humans with souls and whatnot. Why are we saying it's totally okay to do shit like that to them that we don't do back home? Like, what? This is messed up. And they started reforming it. It was difficult to fully change it. So the hacienda system was still pretty bad, but they abolished the kind of slavery that you saw in the encomienda system, specifically because people's empathy got there. So you're looking here at lessons learned, you know, a century or so later, and they're thinking about this. How do we prevent that shit from happening here? How do we keep the profits flowing? And racism is the way to do that. So if you think about, let's see, okay, so we're in the US, and I'm going to assume a lot of our audience is too, although not all of it. So I'm going to use an American example, even though places like the Caribbean and Brazil took a lot more slaves than the US did. Proportionally, it's a very small share of the total Atlantic slave trade population, but still significant. So you think about like early Virginia colony, they're struggling to survive. Wave after wave of settlers are coming, and people are going through their seasoning period where they're adapting to basically a malarial, swampy climate. It's not really what they're used to. And a lot of people die off. Like a majority of the early waves of migrants all die. Like it's very difficult, but they finally establish themselves. They're building up. What makes the colony work, the reason they don't abandon it though, is tobacco. The discovery of tobacco, and the tobacco is profitable. So they start planting shit tons of this stuff. They're planting it literally in the streets, you know, of their communities. So like they're putting it is everywhere they can, trying to make a bunch of money, because that money will allow them to buy the stuff that they need to make the colony survive and thrive and attract more people and you know, tame the land, so to speak. So it's built around this, right? Well, that makes slavery appealing to some people. So when a Dutch ship pulls up and says, "Hey, bro, you want to buy some slaves?" They're like, what? Oh, you mean that they'll just like work for us? Okay, cool. That's fine. We'll take in people." And initially, they didn't really get it. Like the concept of slavery as a racial condition and slavery as a lifelong condition simply did not make sense to these European Christian settlers. Many of those people were freed after a few years. So they worked them similarly to indentures. Indentured servants are like people from Europe. So they would come over for different jobs. They would sign a labor contract. I'll work for you for 7 years as your slave. And then in exchange, you give me a few acres of land and now I'm a freeholder of my own. Like there's like different contracts you'd sign. They treated a lot of the initial African slaves the same way they treated indentures. As they learned the language, they made a deal with them and say, okay, cool, you're going to work for me for X number of years and then I'll just let you go. And it's cool. Like, so by the time you get into like the later 17th century, there's a significant free black population in Virginia, in addition to slaves and indentures and everything else.
Right.
And what you had to do in response to that was keep people from thinking about what they have in common. Again, there are analogs to this you can find over and over again in tons of other slave colonies. So this is just, I'm picking one as a simple example, right?
Sure.
So one thing that's peculiar about the settlement there is they want to farm, right? They want to establish farms, European-style farms across the land. But as the population is going up, there's only so much available farmland because somebody else lives on all that land.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
I'm following. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a shit ton of like Native Americans. They all live there. It's their land. They're already on it. Like, so the colony is actually trying to discourage people from going out and taking more land, because if that happens, there's going to be a war and they're going to fight. And several times there were conflicts and Native Americans came in and like they massacred, a lot of people in these different colonies early on because they had the numbers, they could do it. Like if you push them too far, they fought back. So encroaching on their land, seizing their land is problematic politically, right? So the government is trying to stop people from doing that. So the first racism that develops here is the one against Native Americans. Because they are a target to be eliminated. And there's something very distinct about English colonization as opposed to, say, earlier Spanish or Portuguese. Very racist in their own ways, but not genocidal in the way that the English were. Because for the English, they looked at people like this and said, you don't know how to use your land. You don't deserve your land. We should just massacre you and take that land and farm it the way it's supposed to be farmed. And people start getting motivated to do this shit. One interesting example of that is Bacon's rebellion. So this is like in the 1670s. He gets a bunch of people, and when the governor is refusing to let them go out there and take land, they like take him prisoner, and they fight to like try and take land. And the goal for them is like, we want to seize a whole bunch of Native American land. What people often forget when they encounter Bacon's rebellion is that Bacon's soldiers, Bacon's men, were both black and white. Like it was a racially integrated force, because the white indentures and the black slaves understood that they shared a common class interest. They did not have freedom or land. They had to work for someone else to survive. And they wanted their own land. That was the path to freedom for a lot of people, was your own land. We forget sometimes today how long that stayed a thing too. You go back to like 1830 and 95% of Americans were self-employed. Like most people didn't have a job the way we do.
Right.
But so
there wasn't that kind of development just yet. I mean, you would
imagine. Yeah, exactly. People mostly you had your own freehold. You farmed, you raised things there, and then you sold your excess to other people, and you bought them things that they could do. So, I make pots instead of farming, but I trade my pots to the farmer for food, and we all just, so it's a very different way of life, in the sense that everyone kind of owned their own land or business. That was the ideal. That's the ideal that was founding the country here, and one of the reasons it's so genocidal too, because the people on the land were in the way. But that force was mixed. So when it was defeated and Bacon died of dysentery, which is always kind of funny to me because his name is Bacon and he died of, anyway, he just shot himself to death.
What's dysentery? I don't know what dysentery is.
Dysentery is like diarrhea from hell. You shit yourself to death. It's terrible. It's like, I don't know. It's a weird kind of association for me. Like, what? But he dies, right? So he dies, his rebellion breaks down, everything collapses, order is restored. But in the aftermath, they have to figure out how to prevent this, how to stop something like this from happening again. So they double down on slavery and end the indenture system. So now all the white people are going to be free by definition, even if they don't own anything. And then they can make a simple distinction. You as a white person are free, right? And you have certain legal rights, like you can testify in court or something like that. We'll take you seriously that way. And then these other people who are working, they're not free. And then you can say, they look different from me. And you can understand that as like a distinction in status, right?
Sure.
Now, technically, that white working class still had far more in common with the slave population. In fact, they were directly disadvantaged by slavery, because if I can get someone, if I have to pay you, right? If I have to pay you $20 an hour to come and like mow my lawn or something, but I can get somebody else to do it for free because I own him and he lives in a shack behind my house, who's going to get the job? Why would I pay you?
Yeah, why would pay me?
How that works? But so the white working class is directly harmed by the existence of slavery, and yet, because they were told their skin color was more important, and they were given certain privileges like testifying in court or being put on the slave patrols. I mean, honestly, the origin of policing in the US is tied to like that kind of property patrols, like, arming people to walk around and like, watch for escaped slaves or something like this. That got people who actually had economically more in common there to think themselves as better than. And it creates, so what you're building here is literally the concept of racism, the idea of dividing people up into distinct categories. Race is a social construct. It's not biological. We've known that.
And you've empowered people now. So there's that sense of power versus no power, limited power.
Yeah, exactly. What we're doing is we're using power relations to structure particular categories and imposing those categories on nature somehow. Like there's nothing genetic about it. I mean, the genetic differences between East and West Africans are greater than either of their differences with like Scandinavians, right? Like there's nothing genetic that creates races. It's just long-term exposure to frickin' sun or whatever, like, like certain bottlenecks that change a little bit of our appearance, but we're all still people,
Right.
But if you can say, look, this person has darker skin than you, therefore they're a different category of person and therefore they don't deserve rights. And you start building on that. So there's several things that come in here. Laws will play a part, religion will play a part, popular culture will play a part, but we're all going to entrench these kind of values. So just kind of quickly on one, I'll give you a piece about the legal structure here. So first off, there's to give you a way of thinking that racism took a while to build up. I want you to compare a couple of cases I'll mention from the 17th century with how it would have been played out in the 19th or 20th century in the U.S. Right, so like the Jim Crow, slave relevance. So in 1630, a white man was arrested, prosecuted, whatever, and he was like publicly whipped for defiling his body in laying with a Negro. And people can look at that and say, look, that's like miscegenation. They think the races should mix. Well, no, it actually was. If you look at the details of the case, it was about the homosexuality. It was two dudes. That's what they were upset about, not that he was black. A more like obvious one, because of all the times that you may have heard like stories, in schools or from other people about like in the Jim Crow era, like some kid would be accused of looking at a white woman, and the next thing you know, he's lynched. Right. You just never believe the person there. Like, the juries would always let the lynchers go, In
how can that be? That's the In
1680, a white woman accused a black man of rape in court. Right. And when the trial went through, like the court actually sided with the black man and accused her of seductive behavior and said that she actually was pursuing this relationship, and then she just changed her mind at some point and is trying to turn on him. So you're trying to imagine in 1880 a case of a white woman saying a black man raped her and an all-white jury saying, no, the black man's fine, he didn't do that.
It's not thinkable.
Yeah, it wouldn't happen. But that's because of 200 years of racist ideologies being beaten into people's heads. this didn't come out of nowhere, right?
You're changing the narrative regularly.
Right.
I mean,
you have to change the way people think. And the first step to that is some laws. So they start passing laws, across the 1660s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They start like laying down some trends to start doing this, right? And they'll start figuring out, people's slavery can be inherited. So if the mother's a slave, then the child's a slave, because that wasn't a default to begin with. So people would, slaves would have kids and they would just be free black people, right? They wouldn't be a slave. So they had to change that. They want to like lock people in and racialize slavery. Then you have to deal with the religious issue, because people were, or one of a couple of religious issues I want to mention, but people were often saying that, oh, my slaves have embraced Christianity. They're good Christians now. Their souls have been saved. I can't keep them as slaves. And they would put in their will to manumit them, or they would do it after a certain amount of time, or they would let them save up money and buy their freedom, or they would just say, okay, you're a Christian now, you're free. There was a whole bunch of paths to manumission that all related to people becoming Christian, and good Christians saying, hey, I cannot oppress a fellow Christian. So they literally passed a law that said baptism cannot exempt people from bondage, that they can be Christian as they want, and you can't let them go. So it got much harder to let slaves go. And by the time you get to the end, by the time you get to, okay, so again, this is stuff in the aftermath of like Bacon's Rebellion, right? There was a law put in place, and this is, God, it's so hard to say this without getting a little angry about it. So the way they described it is, if you were, okay, so imagine you are, let's just by analogy first, right? So you've got like a television, right? Yeah. And your television's not working, it's all staticky or whatever. You might bonk it a couple of times, right? Try the percussive.
Yeah,
we'll bonk
like
it.
Like I did in the 80s to get the bunny ears going. Yeah,
I exactly. Get you. Like, hey, what's going on? Bonk, bonk. Jiggle a little bit. See if it works. And then, but if that doesn't work, is your next step to get a hammer?
No, but
no. Well, okay, so why not?
No.
Why wouldn't I think that it's a really good idea for me to just destroy the television?
Because it's destructive. It's not within my human nature. It's not my human nature to do that.
Well,
or it's not going to fix the issue. It's just going to make it worse.
Yeah, it can fix the issue. It can make it worse. So it's an economic issue. Like I put money, I bought this television.
Right. I have investment in it. So why destroy it?
So why destroy it? So what they argued is, if a slave is beaten to death, if a slave is straight up murdered on the plantation, that cannot be prosecuted as murder, because no sane property owner would destroy their own property that way. So it must have been an accident.
Stupid reasoning.
Yeah, it totally must have been an accident.
Idiotic.
Now, you can kind of see where they're going logic-wise, but it doesn't make sense in this case, because people aren't TVs, and people also get angry at each other. There's all kinds of awful shit. And plus, when you pass a law like this, you create an incentive for people to, like, I don't know, create underground fighting pits and have the slaves murder each other for their entertainment. You can do all kinds of terrible shit because you are free and clear. You can't be prosecuted for murder. They're not people. And that's
there's no recourse. Yeah.
So what you're doing here is you're creating a sense of you're creating a racist ideal there. And one of the ways that it really kind of it digs deep roots culturally passes through religion.
Yeah. So you're emboldening people. To take actions that with no repercussions, no persecution.
Which initially gets a lot of Christians, particularly a lot of Protestants and evangelicals, really kind of offended. They're like, what the fuck? Slavery is terrible. Yeah. And plenty of like Christian movements like the Quakers were like hardcore abolitionists. There were a lot of evangelicals that were hardcore abolitionists that were arguing that this is a terrible system. It brings out the worst in humanity. It brutalizes us. It's terrible. And they are human beings. So that had to be stopped somehow. So instead, they started deploying preachers with a specifically different message, and they started having different people reading out in the sermons. So they might use like Ephesians 6:5 to say, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters, to try and say, look, the Bible says so. right? Or like the book of Timothy says, like that you should count your masters worthy of all honor. Like you shouldn't object to slavery as an idea because this is God's will. This is in the Gospels. This is New Testament shit. This is, it accept it, right? So what they
like
do,
God's chosen people. Sorry.
Yeah, in a sense of like weird chosenness comes in when they basically read races into the Bible. So
and I'm talking Israel's God chosen people.
Yeah, but still, yeah, like a sense of chosenness in general here can be used. And honestly, the church has always had its own versions of that, since creation. But the whole like 3 sons of Noah thing, right?
Walk us through that. I think it's important to give the audience. Yeah,
the Bible says literally nothing about this at all, but people just invented, right, a story about this that said that Japheth was the progenitor of Western Europeans, of white people, right? But Shem was the progenitor of Jews and all the Oriental races, like the Muslims, whatever here. While Ham was the progenitor of the African nations, so of black people. And it's never really it's too complicated a story to go into right now. But there's like a line in the Bible where God curses Noah curses Ham for doing something wrong, right? And what they're doing, there's a reason they chose Ham for black people, because they can say the blackness is a curse by God because Noah condemned his son for doing something wrong. So his son went on to create the African race, which deserves to be enslaved for all time because they're cast out by God in this sense. They invented out of whole cloth a racial ideology that they read into a part of the Hebrew Bible.
Got it.
So this Noah story has nothing to do with races, but it does. It becomes the basis of, like, I don't know, the Klan's a form of Christianity, right?
It's the justification for their actions.
Right. Yeah. Which, when you tie it to religion, and this is a reason that the legacy of the Klan is so strong, even though as distinct organizations, it sort of faded away. There's obviously tons of successors and whatnot, like your Patriot Front assholes are still, that's just, I mean, Proud Boys still Klansmen, right? But the reason that the spread of Klan ideologies was so important in the US is that it tied racism to Christianity. And that has created a problem that bedevils many forms of Protestantism and evangelicalism in the US all the way to the present. It leaves a lot of threads down that separate people and allow them to justify the power relations. So you've got one building up there, and at the same time, among your more scientifically inclined people, they come up with their own way. Well, we're not going to approach this religiously, but we're going to think of it in terms of there's different races that evolve and they're all different, and white people are on top because look at us, we're more powerful, we have more guns, so evolution must have made us superior somehow. And you just puff yourself up in some weird ass scientific,
you pound your chest as though you're some sort of superior class,
right? And never mind all the historical circumstances that led that to that, because for most of its history, Europe was a fucking backwater, right? I mean, the Middle East had, Muslims would have like running water and sewers and public toilets and public baths, and Europeans had piss buckets and were throwing their shit into the middle of the street. I mean, one was clearly more civilized and richer than the other, but circumstances change over time. The circumstances at this particular moment when Europeans were powerful was tied to these racial discourses, which then made it a cultural problem, a belief system that it doesn't matter what the circumstances are now, I can believe that my race is superior. And they start dividing all these things up. So people come up with like grades of intelligence and say that different races are less intelligent or less capable or whatever. They start inventing all these characteristics they carry in their blood. And this affects tons of things. So like, I don't know, like the Nazi and anti-Semitic ideals that thought that like greed was somehow in Jewish blood, that they were just manipulative. Ooh, I want to take all your money, or like all this, that it's somehow like as a biological thing for them. They did the same thing with a lot of Black Africans, and some of that was just, oh my God, it's so funny how stupid it is to have come up in the first place, because they'll look at something that is actually a form of resistance. So a lot of people on slave plantations, they're going to slow down. They're not going to work hard, right? Because why do it? You're a fucking slave. What do you get out of that? So when the guy comes up to you and says, I want you to go out and do this, that, and the other thing, if you look at him and go, what? Okay. And then just take your time and do things wrong, that's actually that's a work slowdown. Unions do that shit. Like you're just, it's passive resistance. Like I can't fight you, bro, because you've got a gun, but I can deliberately misunderstand what you say and work really slowly at it. So what comes out of that? People start saying, oh, black people are lazy and they're stupid. Do you see how ironic that is? Like it's just
stupid.
A weird twist, because it was actually genius of them to resist an unjust system in that way, and for their trouble, their actions got read into racist terms and turned into stereotypes that you can still hear on the streets today.
Yeah, well, that's the ignorance with those in power that don't understand what was happening. What was happening and continues to happen today. I mean, you said language matters, right? Yeah. And so the influence of language, the influence of behavior to this day still kind of dictates how people respond to certain situations.
Yeah, it does. The in power part is complicated because it's not a universal. There's plenty of like thoroughly clueless people who do manage to climb that ladder, but people in power,
the ones that fake it till they make it,
they do know. They're the ones who know what they're doing.
Right.
Like, so so later in the 19th century, so after a few decades of slaves being freed and they're working as sharecroppers, they're poor, and then there's white working class around them, they start banding together in solidarity unions around populist ideals and talking about how we need to see some of the wealthy land here and redistribute for ourselves. We deserve to do better. So they start organizing politically to challenge the political status quo of Republicans and Democrats in the country, right? So the Jim Crow system was a direct response to that. It was created in the late 19th century to stop populist engagement there, to stop black and white workers from finding solidarity. Humans will often do it. Humans will find a way to work together, and then someone will come along and they'll manipulate that. They'll twist it. They'll argue that you shouldn't work with them because of this, that, and the other reason. And it's like a basic divide and rule tactic. It's true of all empires and nation states. If you can divide people up, it's easier to control them.
Yeah, we've seen that recently. And not to discount the anti-black rhetoric, but people will take advantage of that and continue to amplify it. And if we don't address it right away, it can go down a spiral. It could spiral really quickly. And I see that on the TikTok platform and in the community where, yes, there is anti-black rhetoric. We're not addressing it right away. And those that want to divide and conquer are saying, see, this is why you shouldn't work with this group. And continue to amplify and hold platforms that oppose the connection and try to sow division. And so it's up to us as a community to say, we recognize it, we see it, remove our own biases, and let's address it head on so those on the sidelines don't take advantage of it.
There's so many attempts to seed those things in. People who are themselves indoctrinated by these power structures and believe these ideologies will do it. And then they're the people themselves that are funding that kind of work, right? So you're like, okay, there's a black Trump supporter in the US who's now, good for him doing it, but I wish he saw the irony in this. He's now suing for racial discrimination from the group he worked for, because he was working for a while for one of the Koch brothers, think tanks, one of their foundations. And while he was working there, they kept calling him their slave. They were using a lot of like tokenist, kind of like directly racist language. And when he objected to that, he was fired. So he's rightly suing about it, but like doesn't seem to understand that that's kind of the core of that belief system, that they really, that's what they identify with, that racism is a part of all that the right is doing. And it always has been, because it's tied ultimately to power structures. So maybe your billionaire funders who are dumping cash in to create these think tanks, they probably know better and they just don't care because they're interested in power and wealth for themselves. But tons of people are just sucked into these systems. So thinking about TikTok, we see all the time people trying to like slip in neo-Nazi rhetoric, to people who have a very just reason to be angry at Israeli Jews. But this is rhetoric specifically about Jews as a racial group, right? In global conspiratorial senses. And when they're slipping that stuff in and it's not stopped, it can get into the back of your heads, and it can bubble up in bad ways, right? So these things, they're around because they've been around for centuries, and they have existed for centuries because they were consciously developed from the early modern period on as a way of increasing state power, increasing capital power, by dividing and ruling people, by dividing people against one another, right? Racism is a product of a very elitist worldview that's determined to hold on to power, and the old ways of doing it don't work anymore. I can't say, oh, the divine right of kings, I deserve to be in charge. I have to find some other reason to get you to listen to me. So we come up with these different ideological frameworks. Racism is a very significant component of them. It has not gone away at all. And people who are telling themselves we've solved racism are in massive denial about how it affects their own lives.
Oh, I totally agree. And it's when that last point you just mentioned, for those of you listening, I hear that, there is no racism. You're just obviously living in a different part of the world. You're just completely oblivious to what's actually happening. The denial is an understatement.
American be racist. We elected Obama.
So we're at an hour and 25.
We're a little early, but we're a bit over an hour. Yeah. So this was the point I wanted to wind down anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have some time if you want to kind of. Where would you kind of like to wrap it up if you had
to close it, because it also opens up some things that we can deal with later in discussions of when we go back to continuing the capital story or imperialism or something else. I mean, these ideas, as they build up, they have real consequences, and they make it really hard for people's natural moralities to come out. It changes the way we think. At the end of the day, when people are fighting each other and arguing over things, there's a tendency to always assume the other side is immoral somehow, but their morality will frequently just differ, right? They've taken in a different moral code. So by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, so in like discussions of imperialism, I like using like some of the expositions as an example. So like the Exposition Universelle in Paris, like around 1900. You're building like these big pavilions, all this huge display. You're attracting tons. It's a big tourist thing, and everyone comes, and you get to see all the groovy stuff from all around the world, all the things that empire has brought to Europe and whatnot. They had straight up human zoos. Like they had places they set up to look like a fake savage village, and planted people in there and put them in loincloths and told them to stand there and just, act normal while people came and like, wow, look at that. Ooh, just like you're going to the freaking zoo and looking at like,
Jesus.
But that kind of dehumanization is a consequence of those forces building up across the early modern period and laying down all these threads. So that the very deep racism of the high imperialist period and the 20th century, it didn't come out of nowhere. It built up steadily. We want to understand why, like, Trump's rhetoric still resonates with so many people on a deep level. It's because this country is still racist as fuck because we were founded on it. It predates the existence of the U.S. here, the developments that created racism. This country was founded on genocide and slavery. So,
and the fact that people don't see his rhetoric as such, again, surprising as shit.
Well, the problem there is that they know the word means something bad, but they agree with him. Therefore, it can't be that bad thing. It's the same reason people want to say that, the Nazis were socialists, the fascists were socialists. Like they want to like project it off into somebody else, because if they had to look at what they were doing, if they really understood what they were doing, they are the fascists. And then you would have to take responsibility for the actions of past fascists. But no one wants to do that. So you have to project it onto someone else. It's a kind of cognitive dissonance that people adopt. It's a basic coping mechanism. It makes sense that people supporting Trump are saying Trump isn't racist, I'm not racist. Of course they have to say that. But it is suffused with racism from the very first statements he made as a candidate all the way to the present, because it's as American as apple pie. That kind of racism is baked very deeply into our cultural foundations, and you can't just walk away from it saying, I'm not racist anymore. Your choice is to accept racism, either actively or passively, or work against it as an anti-racist. Those are your two choices. Because if you're not opposing racist ideals and structures, then you are accepting them.
Correct.
You are fine with them. You're okay. Like, it's fine.
It sounds to me like it's easy to, it's for his folks, it's easy to conform versus fight against it.
Yeah, because it's just the status quo. It's normal. It's like how they grew up. Why would they think there's anything wrong with that? They don't feel that they're bad. And realistically, no one feels they're the bad guy. That's kind of normal there, right? It's very difficult to look at that. And what they often misunderstand is they think that, we're blaming you for the actions of your ancestors. I'm like, no, that would be literally racist. That's stupid. I'm not blaming you for your Confederate great-great-granddaddy. I'm attacking you for celebrating what he did now, for saying that he's a fucking hero, for fighting for a constitution that locked slavery in permanently. The Confederacy was founded for one reason only: to guarantee white supremacy and slavery would persist. But so it's an action right now that they're doing wrong. I wouldn't blame anybody for what their ancestor did. That makes no sense at all.
And I think that's an important call out.
Today is a problem.
Yeah, I think that's an important call out, regardless of the situation, right? Not to attack based on actions of your forefathers, or versus your response to it. Are you fighting against it, or, to your point, are you celebrating it? Right? Are you celebrating a genocide, or are you fighting against a genocide?
Right, exactly. This is why, again, you can't. I don't know. In Howard Zinn's terms, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Like, the world it's unfolding right in front of you, and you can choose to be actively involved and take a position on it, or you can just accept what it is. So it's not always just the evil people who are out there, like, being all like pro neo-Confederate or some shit there, but the people who say, that's fine, they can wave their flag, it doesn't hurt me at all. Well, then you are actually on their side. Yeah,
you're complicit.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're thinking about, like, the genocide in Palestine, right? You can either oppose that, support it, or do nothing. And all of that is part of supporting it, because by doing nothing, you are endorsing the status quo that is costing people lives.
Absolutely. And I oftentimes, human nature is to do what's easy versus what's difficult, because there's a lot of work invested in doing that. What's difficult, but the difficult part of what you do changes significantly in terms of the landscape and the narrative. But the easy part is just to sit back and say, F it, I'm just going to not engage, because why? There's nothing that I need to do. I can just accept it for what it is and not worry my little self about it.
Yeah, I think I got a good closing point that actually ties back to the discussion earlier about identity and group identity, right?
Yeah, go for it.
Because one thing that can make it easier, because it is difficult. Most people really struggle with that hard self-examination, asking themselves why they believe certain things, why they do certain things. Like, that kind of critique is difficult, especially since it can often cut people off from a sense of community. It can cut you off from the people that you know, your whole social circle, your family, your religion, whatever. Like, there's all kinds of problems that come up when we challenge these things. If we think about it hard enough and we end up believing differently about something, we can suffer very real social consequences. So the way to do that kind of change for most people has to also involve community. It's one of the reasons that I love like-minded people finding each other and talking to each other, because it's validating. You find a new community you can build relations there, and you strengthen each other. Like you stand shoulder to shoulder with other people who are sharing a similar challenge, and
Yeah.
it feels a little bit easier than doing it yourself because you're not doing it alone. And that's ultimately the way to challenge all these racial discourses, is to work with other people, to build these kind of like rainbow coalitions that bring everyone together and get them talking about these things and actually do something.
Yeah.
And without that kind of community sense, that kind of communal solidarity that we can build up there, we can't do it. People don't have the strength to challenge these systems on their own. We have to do it together.
I like that because it also promotes innovation of thought and innovation of change. Even though they're like-minded, we all come with our unique perspectives and unique ideas, and we can truly have an impact on the discussion. And so it's a good call out. It's a good call out.
Yep.
Wow. So great discussion, man. Let's just kind of recap real quick. We covered One Country by Ali Abu Ni'meh. We talked about imperialism, racism, capitalism, and racism, and how there's an intersectionality there, and how it's been ingrained in people's minds for hundreds of years. And so I appreciate the conversation. That's a wrap to episode 13. Looking forward to this getting published on this upcoming Monday, which is the 9th. You guys can catch this episode on YouTube, Podbean, iHeart, Apple, Amazon, and Spotify. Also, you can catch Dr. Liam O'Mara on Fridays on TikTok for office hours from 3 on. You can catch us together also for book club on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7:40 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So grateful for the discussion today. Very thoughtful. I learn a lot every time I hear you speak, and I hope people do the same. Please comment, share, let us know, give us some feedback on what you think of the episodes. The only way we can grow is by getting feedback from you. And if you have topics in mind that you want to hear from us, also add those to the comments. That said, Liam, anything else to wrap us up?
Live long and prosper.
Have a great day, everybody.
Have a good.
Appreciate you all. Take care.